Welcome back. So, right now we're going to talk about two interrelated themes, kind of business power and critiques of business, and we're all going to kind of lump that under the subject of business history. If you were to believe Karl Marx, he would say that history is the narrative of class struggle, specifically how members of society have struggled against business and also to an extent government, the bourgeoisie. Sounds kind of like the dominance model we talked about earlier, right? So that's why for this lecture we're going to link the story of power and struggle and the search for legitimacy right alongside history. However, this is going to be a little bit different than your previous history courses because it's going to have a distinctly business-oriented focus to it. Okay? So first of all, we got to talk about one of the key terms that we're going to talk about. And that is power. What is power? He-Man said he had the power. Apologize for the corny 80s reference. But power is the ability to make someone do something. Okay? And you can make someone do something through like physical force, like you push or pull, so you change your action. Or you can also do it through perhaps maybe a narrative or a moral. Hey, could you do this for me? Or maybe there's an exchange. Hey, for $5, could you, perform this task for me? Buy me lunch, whatever. Okay. Now, under power is business power, and that is the force whereby a company induces any one of their stakeholders to act, to change their behavior, or to do something for that business. Okay. Now, the social contract would indicate that business power is legitimate because there might be a moral basis. Okay? Think about corporate social responsibility like we're going to talk about just a little bit later. Another concept, and we mentioned it very briefly in the first lecture from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was legitimacy. Okay? Legitimacy is what we would call the use of power that is in some way rightful. Now, rightful, and what does this mean? Basically, if you are doing something that is for the common good or the common will, as Rousseau would say. Okay? If you are acting in such a way that validates the social contract, that most people would think is a good thing or a positive action, that's legitimate. Now, saying exactly what legitimacy is very difficult. It's kind of like a form, okay, legitimacy. But identifying what is not legitimate is very easy. So we can't always know what is legitimate behavior, but typically after we've crossed that threshold or thought about crossing that threshold, we know that in some way the social contract has been violated. We know that in some way our actions were not legitimate. Legitimacy. Now, corporate power is divided into two levels. And, you can typically think of corporate power having an impact on society, but it also has an impact on government, as we're going to talk about in a couple of lectures. And you've got two levels. You've got surface level and deep level. If we were to tie them back to some of the concepts we've talked about previously, so surface level typically causes some sort of a change. Surface level power changes something that's very visible, very immediate, very short term. Typically something that would be part of the internal environment or the external environment like we talked about in Lecture 2. And then the deep level, you're talking about fundamentally changing society over the long run, or aggregate changes in industrial growth. This ties more into possibly the external environment, but more likely the deep historical forces as we discussed previously. So as we mentioned, there's kind of different levels of corporate power, but then there's also spheres of corporate power. Now, I won't list all of these, but you've got things like economic power. A corporation can alter events based in the marketplace. Technological power. A corporation can influence the kinds of technologies that are developed, both at a deep historical level and at the external or market level. They can influence governments through political power. They also can change laws, usually for their benefit, through legal power. They can change cultural values and habits, institutions through cultural power. They can control the forces or exploit the forces of nature through environmental power. And then, of course, there's power over individuals, or the internal level of analysis, or within a business, through power over individuals. So, again, these levels and spheres of power correspond quite nicely to different aspects of the dynamic environment which we discussed previously. Okay, so we'll wrap this portion up of our introduction, and then when we come back, we'll continue with some theories to support business history and the critics of business, and then we'll dive right into business history.